Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Josep Bohigas. I'm an architect. Can you hear me? I'm an architect, and I'm very pleased to moderate this roundtable with this great panel that I think has a very clear title: Urban Planning at the Service of Life. But that at the same time, it has a tricky subtitle, which is Building the City of the Future. I'm saying that I feel that it's a quite tricky subtitle because always when I see the world building next to the world future, it gives me, I became a little suspicious and maybe a little bit fearful or even a little bit scary. Sometimes it creates a confusing idea, an idea that, at least from an architect point of view, like mine, that the future of the city must be materialized with buildings, and probably with those shiny, autosufficient, modern, and smart buildings. I'm saying this because I'm lucky to be the director of an agency that's called Barcelona Regional, a strategic planning agency. And many times people come to our agency to ask us how are going to be the cities of the future, or basically how is going to be Barcelona in the future. And many of them, they expect that we take out our plans and that we take our new neighborhoods, which are going to be those shiny and smart neighborhoods, and that we explain like that we kind of recreate a new future. And we do completely the opposite thing. We answer always the same. We take them to the window, we make them look through the window and look at the city and tell them that the city of the future is the city that they see now. That the city is this one. And maybe what it needs to be changed is the way we use it, the air we breathe, how we move, the way we connect, play, work, the way we amuse, love, sleep, and eat. And the way, of course, that we have access to a decent housing. What is urgent to build, then, are not buildings or neighborhoods that you pessimistically erase and then try to think that maybe from some point of new, shiny point of view, we kind of recreate new ideal houses or new ideal neighborhoods. What we need to really do is to build these essential social rights, which is basically the right for the existing city, which is exactly where we are now. No, we are now in a place which exactly expresses this same idea. An idea of a palimpsest of different layers, different periods. We have the Roman via, we have the medieval wall, we have the 19th century servei plan and a market. And of course, what we have on top of all this, we have a new idea with the superblock plan that is the last twist, the last layer that are giving a new opportunity to reinvent itself, the city, and finding and learning better conditions to live in it. The future of Barcelona, and in extension many of the cities in similar contexts, is not something stable that you build from scratch. It's something that is concreted with many temporal layers, many people and many contradictory ideas and setbacks that gives the biggerness and its multiple reality. The city of the future is not a freeze and ideal image, it's a mutable, precious result of many contradictory adaptations and has to constantly be aware and learn to be used in the best existing conditions. So let me start then with an obliged question about the capacity of adaptation of these cities had to rehearse during these recent years because of the pandemic. And the first question that I would give to these ponents that we have today, which are 5 excellent ponents like Francesca Bria, which is innovation economist and digital policy expert, president of the National Innovation Fund of Italy. She was Commissioner of the Technology and Digital Innovation at Barcelona City Council and is currently working on the development of the new European Bauhaus. Also we have Brent Tonderland, urban planner and president of the Tonderland Urban Works in Vancouver, advisor to cities and innovative urbanism, transportation and urban planning. He was chief planner of Vancouver, Canada, manager of Central City Planning and Design in Calgary, and founding president of the Council of Canadian Urbanism. We also have Shirley Rodriguez, that hopefully will connect in a minute. Has an impressive track record of developing new environmental policies in London since 2005, and nowadays is the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy of London. And of course, we have Janet Sant, political scientist and jurist, second Deputy Mayor of Barcelona City Council for Town Planning, Infrastructure and Mobility, and as well, she is the President of Barcelona Regional. And we also have David Ballard that will start with him. He couldn't be with us today, but he has recorded a message that we will start by listening to him. He's also the Deputy Mayor of the city of Paris. So we can go on with the first intervention of David Ballard.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for your invitation, and so sorry not to be here today, but I want to take just a few minutes to maybe share with you the politics we are making in Paris. Is it a big revolution in Paris because we want to transform the capital of France, to adapt the town in face of crisis, climate, and to answer solutions to pollution of air and noises. So we are making a big transformation of public space. The rule is very simple. We want less cars and thermic cars, and we want more space for bicycle lanes, more space for pedestrians, more space for nature, because we need a lot of nature in town if we want to refresh town when in front of the climate crisis. So it's very important to make this transformation. We have some an action in the center of Paris with a zone with less circulations. We want to forbid the transit circulation in the center of Paris. It is a big area, and we will transform that, and we will transform, of course, the way of thinking the town with these big actions. We have an action in all the areas in Paris with embellir votre quartier. This is a very, very ambitious transformation in each areas. It is the same rules, less cars, but more space for bicycle, nature and pedestrian, and of course public transportation. And the last action we have is an action towards children. We have decided to reduce or suppress circulation and car space around schools. We have making that in more than 200 schools in Paris. So that's very, very ambitious. All these actions, of course, are combined with the goals to reduce and to decarbonize mobility. Of course, we are giving a lot of money to develop bicycle lanes in Paris. We have making a lot of temporary bicycle lanes during the COVID crisis, and now we are building real and perennize these bicycle lanes, and we will develop a lot of more and more bicycle lanes, because we want to make Paris very friendly for people who want to take their bicycles to work and to move in capital. We want, of course, to forbid diesel and thermic motors for switch to electrical cars or other things with less impact for environment and less impact for pollution. That's a big transformation we are making now. So this is just, you know, just in a few minutes what we are making in Paris. I'm very sorry not to be here to discuss with you, but it's just you know, photography that we are making. This is a big revolution that we have. The project we have for Paris is not just for Paris. It's also, I know, for all town in the world and in Europe. And I am very happy to see the other metropole, the other towns making this big and huge transformation. Paris is just one part of this big transformation, and I would be very happy to work with you and to share the experiments and the experimentations we have in Paris with other towns, because what I believe is we have to accelerate this transformation and these revolutions.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to go on and we'll start with Francesca Bria, and with one question that's for all the opponents. As I was saying before, we are obliged to ask you a little bit about the capacity of adaptation that these cities, the cities that you represent, had during these last recent years. What are the main lessons learned during and after this deep and unexpected crisis, health crisis? And are we now in better position to face the old and future challenges? ¿Estamos preparados para afrontar ahora, después de lo que hemos pasado, para afrontar los nuevos retos? ¿Esta crisis nos ha enseñado alguna cosa que nos prepara mejor para este futuro inmediato? Francesca, adelante.
Hi, hello. It's great to be here with you. Sorry not to be there in presence. I would have loved to be in Barcelona for this event. And I think this event is obviously very timely, and it brings together all these important experiences where I think that cities, one of the main strong thing about cities is this capacity to be in a network of cooperation and solidarity and build these strong diplomacy networks. That is absolutely what we need to go beyond these multiple crises that we're living. So I don't represent any cities. As you said before, I used to be the Chief Technology and Digital Innovation Officer of the City of Barcelona. So I did work with Jeanette and Ada and the whole government in implementing forward-looking and radical strategies to move towards a more ecological, participatory, digital and social justice city. So I do have that kind of background, but I think maybe it will be more important to put on the table my work that I'm doing now at European level, and in particular with the new European Bauhaus, and how do I see the importance of cities in the kind of broader context of what Europe needs to do now with both the ecological and the digital transition. So I think that cities are obviously uniquely positioned to address the challenges of the post-pandemic times, and they should be perceived as an engine of change towards the green and ecological transition with social cohesion. And I think this is a very important element, which the entire European Union wants to prioritize now with the next generation EU investment plans. So you probably know that Europe is investing more than 2 trillion euros at the moment for the post-recovery phase to move towards a more resilient and more just economy. And at the center of this plan, there is actually the Green Deal, which is the new growth strategy of the European Union, which has the main objective of making Europe climate neutral in 2050. Local administrations, I think, that have the ability, the agility and the proximity, as we heard from Paris, and obviously we will hear from Barcelona and possibly London, to actively, to rapidly transform, and in many cases, they are already considered a reference when we talk about sustainable mobility, when we talk about the green transition, when we talk about affordable housing, when we talk about participatory democracy, and when we talk about a real shift in the way we live. So because of the proximity to the real problems of citizens, we think that cities will be agents of social cohesion and try to put forward concrete policies also to overcome inequalities and divisions. And we see them, of course, increasing with the pandemic. So as we know, there is a strong link between the pandemic, the climate crisis, and the impoverishment of biodiversity. And so we are in a moment, I would say, of wake-up call, where we have this imperative to transform our cities towards climate neutrality. So in this way, we need to rethink public spaces, the so-called popularized 15-minute cities model that guarantees proximity to citizens and access to public essential services in order to establish, a new relationship also with what is important in our life. And obviously, the Superilla of Barcelona being one of the most, one of the strongest example, I think, in Europe. It gives us the possibility to see how we're going to decarbonize our cities and move towards a circular economy vision, establishing a new relationship with nature, so bringing back green and bringing back forest and nature to the city, and of course the effort to plan a new way of work, balancing the time we spend at home with the time we spend in the office, which is going to mean rethink radically life in our cities. And I like the thing you said in the introduction, that the future is what we are living now. So when we think about the future, we should look at the city that we have now and change the way we inhabit that, and the way we basically empower local communities in order to adapt to this big transformation. Because I think that the crisis has also highlighted the fragility and vulnerability as a society, and it highlighted also the social and economic differences between the cities. So status, gender, access to resources, access to healthcare, and so on. And so we know that the people most affected by the pandemic crisis are also the most vulnerable communities that have less access to public healthcare, for example, or to social security services. So in the way we are going to think about the public space, we also have to think about social inequalities first. So the priority, of course, is to reorganize urban life and to promote sustainable democratic innovation that does not increase social inequalities. So the network of cities, Barcelona, Paris, Milan, London, and many others, also smaller ones, they are basically key allies, I think, to this recovery from the pandemic, and they're showing the immense potential that local governments have to basically move towards a stronger, more ecologically and more social justice Europe. In particular, if I have maybe one more minute, I would talk about, just briefly, but we can elaborate upon later in the discussion, about the importance that we give to how cities are going to put forward concrete projects that touches the life of citizens and transform their daily life towards the direction of more ecology, more social cohesion, and democratic digitization, which also implies radical participatory democracy from citizens, because at the very, I think, center of this pandemic, of course, is fear and the the capacity of people to trust public administration, to trust their urban ecosystem, and to trust their neighbors even, will depend by our capacity to revive democracy and to revive the possibility of citizens to participate in the city life and in the decisions that we take in the future. So, for example, when we talk about the Green Deal, which I think is the most important policy that the European Commission and the European President is putting forward, we have to really think that when it comes to sustainability and climate change, we can turn things around for the better only if we start from concrete projects in local communities that can change the built environment, public spaces in cities, and also in countrysides, because we don't have to remember to forget that countrysides are also very important. And one of the visionary projects that Europe is actually putting forward is the new European Bauhaus, which is the intention to couple the Green Deal with a cultural and artistic movement that basically, like, it was for the Bauhaus school at the apex of the modernist era in the 1920s and 30s, that formed the cornerstone of new practices and the very physical embodiment of the concept of sustainability. The Bauhaus movement managed to merge the science of ecology and design and laid the foundation of modernist architecture. And now I think we are called to understand what is this new cultural and urban movement that can lead us to a real transformation in the way we produce and consume, in the way we decarbonize our cities and industry, in the way we're going to need to restore our land and really make our buildings more efficient, reforesting the urban fabric and make our cities cleaner and greener. And obviously we do have a lot of new innovations, new tools, also digital technologies and data that, if we govern in a democratic way, can help us to rethink our urban space and rethink cities. But I think we really need to increase the capacity of communities from the bottom up. So real people in places like cities to organize and adapt in the new reality. And I think projects like the Superilla, the Superblock in Barcelona, and what I heard from the Vice Mayor of Paris, it's really the type of projects that we need in order to make the new European Bauhaus and the European Green Deal real. So to make it real and tangible, to transform in a concrete way the life of communities and people. So to make this transformation real for people, that is absolutely what we need.
Thank you, Bria. Thank you very much. For your point of view, and I think I completely agree that some of the great lessons that we have now and the opportunities that we have with all this amount of money that is coming from Europe and from other places to solve and to save these problems, this crisis that we are living. And I'm sure that the Green Deal and definitely the new Bauhaus, which is putting culture and urbanism and digital transformation in the same level and work together. So now, Brent, a little bit the same question. I'm sure that in Canada you have a completely different city, completely different context, but definitely this crisis has hit all the cities in the world. So I would say the same question. Which lessons you think we may have learned, and are we in better position now to face these old and future challenges?
Good evening, everyone, and good morning. It's morning here in Canada. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Well, Francesca covered a lot, so I'll think about what I can add. I should start by saying that it's been almost 10 years since I was chief planner of Vancouver, so I won't speak specifically for Vancouver, although I still do a lot of work here. I do work for cities on almost every continent on the planet except for Antarctica. And What I found is that there's actual more commonality between strategies and approaches in cities around the world than there are differences. But what there are cities that are showing leadership, and there are cities that are not showing leadership, to be perfectly blunt. There are cities that are learning the lessons, and there are cities that are resisting with almost all their strength the learning of lessons and the affecting of change. So the cities that were already good at changing in response to the pre-existing challenges they already had, those cities are embracing the new observations, the new responsibilities that come from what we've learned in the pandemic. And the cities that were already, frankly, bad at addressing their pre-existing conditions are sort of trying their best to stick their head in the sand and not learn. And if they are learning, they only learn temporarily. And so the conversation is about immediately going back to the old normal as soon as the crisis is over, as soon as the emergency is over. What I would say about what cities have learned, what I appreciated about the actions that cities were taking early in the pandemic was it was all based on this inescapable observation of what we were feeling and observing. Immediately during the pandemic, it became obvious to everyone how tight cities are. And it's because cities were already tight before we started having to separate ourselves by 2 meters from all of our neighbors when we're walking down the sidewalk. And the first conversation was about density of cities. And that was the wrong conversation. People were immediately starting to say that density was bad. And I and others vigorously pushed back against that and said, no, the problem in a pandemic is not density. As a matter of fact, density and dense cities can weather pandemics very well because of the services and supports that come along with density in cities. The problem is crowding. And how do we address the issue of crowding, whether you're in a city or a suburb or even in a rural area when you have, crowded events? And what we realize is that we all felt tight in our cities because we felt crowded in our need to stay at least 2 meters separate. We felt crowded in our sidewalks. We felt crowded on our subways and in our public transit. And we felt crowded in our public spaces as we tried to get out of our houses when we were allowed to and get some fresh air and exercise in our city parks. So many of our immediate observations were about this sense of crowding. And the aha moment for ordinary people, because most of us who worked in city building already knew this, but what became very obvious to everyone that we who are our neighbors in our cities is that we were crowded because of cars. Most of the space that we have in our cities had already been surrendered to the car. Our streets were primarily for cars, and everything else was tight. Everything else we were trying to do in cities, whether it was getting around, being outside for respite or mental health, exercise, going out and eating out in the street on our sidewalks and in our streets. We were trying to do all those things within the leftover space after all the space we had surrendered quite stupidly to cars. And so powerfully, it started a conversation about reallocating space in our streets, reprioritizing and even creating new parks and public spaces where people wouldn't be in danger of being hurt by cars as they were trying their best to protect themselves from the virus. So we had this realization that space was the issue. We've already heard from both speakers how important space is and how the reconsideration of space. I suspect we're going to hear from all our speakers because that really was the primary realization, the primary learning in this pandemic. We needed more space in cities. Density was not the problem, but crowding was the problem. And we needed to readdress the space that we had surrendered to cars. So that translated into rethinking the lanes or even closing streets, widening our sidewalks, rethinking the on-street parking and creating space for people to recreate or for outdoor seating to keep small businesses and restaurants alive during this pandemic. basically rethinking all that space we had surrendered to cars. At the same time as we were developing strategies to manage crowds on public transit and what have you. And at the same time as we were seeing this massive bike boom, we had already been seeing over the last 5 years or so in international cities, a big boom in urban biking. In the cities that built the safe, separated and protected infrastructure, we had already been seeing this bike boom. But boy, did that bike boom get to another level during this pandemic, because we wanted alternatives to the car. We wanted alternatives to public transit. And so the question is, will people stay on their bikes as we start to move out of the pandemic? So our learnings have been about both small things like our streets and our sidewalks, and whether our homes can accommodate home-based work, and whether we have a balcony to be able to get out of the house and do it safely. And all of these small observations about how we live, how we work, how we get educated virtually, etc. We've had many, many learnings on that are translating into a permanent conversation about what has changed permanently. But I, for one, and others have been fighting to make sure that we also paid attention to the big changes that could come out of this pandemic. And I said from the beginning of the pandemic, one of the biggest risks is that we double down on cars, that we double down on suburban sprawl, because we're afraid of transit, because we're afraid of density. And we continue to exacerbate the pre-existing crises we already had around social equity and affordability and public health related to how we design our cities and suburbs, and climate and the climate crisis. We double down on those by ending up building more sprawl, more car dependency in response to this pandemic. I, for one, have been saying if we do that, our future will be much, much worse, because we know that there are many consequences to those pre-existing conditions of things like climate change. Ironically, one of the consequences of climate change is more and worse pandemics. So if we responded in the big sense by building more sprawl, more car dependency, weakening our public transit because we think people won't want to take it anymore, and in doing so create this self-fulfilling prophecy that we're going to be sprawling more and using our cars more, we end up creating a much worse future coming out of the pandemic than we had going into the pandemic. I have observed cities around the world. I have noted many times what particular parts of the world have done well. I have complimented, for example, European cities in particular, because it is the European cities that were almost immediately during the pandemic talking about permanent changes, not temporary changes for as long as the pandemic occurred, but it was European cities, probably not surprisingly, because you were already good at responding to crises better than other parts of the world, going back to the 1970s oil crisis, for example. You knew that this was just another reason to fix your cities and your city's pre-existing conditions. So you were already working on urban pollution. You were already working on climate change and making your streets and places better for people. You might have had a 5-year plan, but then your European city essentially implemented your 5-year plan in 5 weeks instead of 5 years because of the urgency that the pandemic created. So I give European cities credit for being the most, what I might call, permanence-minded. You were immediately talking not about temporary, not all your cities, but you were immediately talking, many of your cities were talking about permanent changes that addressed your pre-existing conditions, things that you were already planning and doing anyway, but now you're just speeding them up and doing them right away. I give Latin American cities credit because Latin American cities were the first to take action at all. Latin American cities are very good at pilots and experiments and trying things and seeing how they work. So they already had a culture of acting quickly. I always say I've worked in many Latin American cities, and I say that Latin American cities know a good idea when they hear it, find a way to do it cheaply, and do it really fast, often because their mayors can only run for one term at a time and can't do 2 successive terms. So their mayors are often super interested in getting things done fast. So it's not surprising that cities like Bogota, for example, were the absolute quickest at transforming streets for people and for bikes, addressing the public transit challenges of crowding, and doing it all really quickly. They were the first. North American cities and Australian cities have not been as good because we've tended to be slow. Our culture has been more risk averse. And when we make changes, we're always talking about those changes being temporary. And frankly, many North American cities only made changes when they really, really got so much pressure from this international competition of other cities. In other words, so many of their own citizens were saying, look at what Paris has been doing. Look at what Milan did. Look at what Barcelona's doing. And essentially shamed North American cities into taking action, and then shamed North American cities into making those actions permanent. New York is a great example of that. New York did many very good changes, but only did them much, much later after almost trying everything else to not make changes. And they insisted that they were temporary, and only after huge pressure from their own citizens have they announced that many of those changes, like transforming streets for outdoor seating, for example, are going to be long-term or permanent changes. So it's been fascinating for me to see how the culture of cities has translated into both observations and learning and the approach to action. If you already had a culture of bold leadership, if you already had a culture of quick action and making strategic adjustments, rather than trying to be perfect before you make any action at all, if you already had a culture of thinking permanently rather than temporarily, your cities have done well and weathered this pandemic much better and addressed your pre-existing conditions, your pre-existing crises that you already had, like urban pollution. If, on the other hand, your culture was to take far too much time, overanalyze things, which is frankly what many North American cities suffer with, you have eventually done some good things once you've essentially been shamed into it. But many North American, Australian cities have been having the debate about whether any of the things they've done in the context of the pandemic need to be permanent or not. And that's a disappointing conversation for those kinds of cities to have. So I've been talking a lot about what might be called winner and loser cities, the cities that have learned and adjusted and adapted and addressed their pre-existing conditions will be the winners globally in the global competition for talent, for capital and investment, for success. And the cities that only make changes slowly and reluctantly and extremely cautiously, if at all, have been and will be the losers coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you very much. I think that after listening, I think that the way that you read what's happening in Europe, it's very interesting to see how this applies to cities like Vancouver too, and to see if these kind of cities can really have those lessons that can be really directly applied, which I'm not completely sure, but because of course the houses, the streets, the density that you were talking, the homes, the public spaces are completely different in terms of pressure. So it would be nice to learn and to know with Shirley Rodriguez. I don't know if she has connected already to hear from her and the experience in London, which I'm sure that they went through that pandemic and they probably have lessons to share.
I couldn't quite hear you, but I'm sort of just going to just tell you a little bit about what we're doing in London and what the main lessons were that we learned from the pandemic. And I just caught the end of Brent's discussion there. I mean, obviously, the pandemic has had a massive impact on travel. Demand in London, our rail and bus ridership has collapsed, as happened across many cities. But we use that opportunity for making our streets safer for people to social distance as they moved around the capital, to really take that bold leadership and try and reimagine our streets, partly to, as I said, to allow people to travel safely, but also to avoid a car-led recovery. And that street space program was developed in a matter of weeks. We delivered a lot of temporary cycle routes, low traffic neighborhoods, expanded our school streets program, which basically closed off traffic outside schools, and you know, had a dramatic impact across the city and really accelerated our programs. But you know, I noted what Brent said about, you know, being bold. But we had to do these under experimental sort of orders, you know, without consultation, and that meant that some of the projects that went in weren't always right, weren't designed right, because they did go in a hurry. But I think what we did see is that people liked the difference that it made. You know, the cleaner air, you know, the ability to, for the first time in many years, start to cycle and become more confident in using their that ability to travel around the city. So as lockdown ended and as the pandemic starts to fade and people start to go back to work, and we're unfortunately seeing road traffic start to increase to pre-pandemic levels, but we are still seeing people using those cycle lanes, the protected ones particularly, more people using that for their journeys back to work, or indeed to go shopping or for leisure. And that has been, you know, a really positive opportunity from the terrible impacts of the pandemic. But we have to do more. And whilst our underground and bus travel and rail travel start to recover, and, you know, every week we're seeing that grow, we need to make sure that we see that decrease that we were seeing in road traffic really keep falling. And the way we do that really is to make sure that we talk about the benefits, the health benefits, the air pollution benefits that this brings, climate change as well, but often people feel very personally about their family's health. So that's sort of what we major on. And we use that as an opportunity to really build on the experimental schemes and try and design out some of the sort of flaws that were in there so they still stay in. And a couple have had to come out. We've had quite vocal opposition in some areas of the city to them, but I think for the most part, people really like that idea. So I think I'll stop there and hand over to the panel.
Good. And I'm going to ask you another question, if you let me, Shirley, because I know that you're going to leave us soon. I don't know how much time you have left, but I will ask you a little bit in the terms of a model. No? You know that always we kind of try to classify the things that are happening in many different cities, the things that are trying in terms of a model, and we know that the models that we are, or the model that at one point they talk about the Barcelona model during the 80s. It was something that it's done, it's over, and now, of course, many people start talking about a new model that could be risen up maybe through the idea of these superblocks. And also, of course, in Paris, they are talking about this another model. They refer it to the 15-minute city, and definitely in London and other cities are kind of creating a new story around this new possibility of creating models. Which model do you think we think would be more effective to simply adapt, to quickly adapt, as Brent was saying? No? Which kind of model do you think would be more suitable to cities like London?
So, in terms of models for London, you know, it's such a big city that essentially London is often called a city of parishes or neighbourhoods, because it is so big, and that many people identify with their local areas. You know, where I live in South London, there are a couple of sort of city or town centres, I guess, Brixton, Camberwell, and so on. So I guess the sort of 15-minute model, the 20-minute city model that people are talking about is becoming more interesting, I think, for people because because of the pandemic and lockdown, they've started to explore their local areas. And it's that sort of approach that we're taking in terms of our green and inclusive recovery. So again, it's more about how do we support people going to school by making sure that they can walk or cycle, or kids can scoot to school safely, but providing the sort of infrastructure, or even just the information about, how they might do that, maybe off the main road, but doing it through what we call quiet ways, through the back streets, and then linking up some of those quiet streets with sort of green infrastructure. So we have those sort of pathways. And that encourages more people to use the networks and more diverse people using it. So not the sort of the usual white men on very fast cycles, hitting our cycleways, but more women, more children, more people from more people of colour. And we have this framework already through the environment and transport strategies, where we are trying to get people through mode shift to use more public transport or active transportation. So those are the sorts of models that we're thinking about. But of course, as a capital city, we still need and want people to use our city, our central London zone. So we have a big campaign at the moment about getting people back to work and reminding them of the attractions, the museums and the nightlife and so on. So that, so really it's about that integrated public transport system and integrating it with the active transport, cycling and walking, so that people can really feel that the approaches that we're taking really reflect what they want to do. And I'll close maybe just with one programme that we've launched, which is called the Future Neighbourhoods 2030 programme, where we have made some funding through our Green New Deal programme. The Mayor has made funding available for local authorities or businesses to bid to identify a local area that they're going to try and improve to show what a future neighbourhood of 2030 would look like, one that meets the Paris climate goals as we head to COP26, that is a zero waste, zero pollution, zero carbon zone, so that people can really see, if that was replicated, what would that look like across London? And at the heart of it is public transport and active transportation. And often it's the sorts of bids that we're seeing are talking about more cycle infrastructure or more electric vehicle infrastructure, or how do we encourage businesses to use local delivery, cargo bikes and so on, so that people really understand that sort of locality approach can really help become a new model for transportation and for the built environment.
Thank you, Shirley, very much. And we have Janet, that she was advising me that maybe I should talk also a little bit in Spanish, and I didn't do it. No lo he hecho, lo siento por quien esté escuchando en castellano y no haya podido entender lo que íbamos hablando. But Janet, the same question. What are the main lessons learned during the pandemic? And maybe connecting with the second question that I was doing also to Shirley, and remembering very much the beginning of this beautiful story, which is Superblock plan. Remembering you in the middle of the street, in the middle of cross, discussing with hundreds of students, hundreds of neighborhoods, discussing and talking about and explaining at that point that nobody exactly knew what it was a Superblock, and how this idea went from that point to nowadays, which is growing every day, and I think that we may start calling it a model. So, Janet.
Sí, ja fa 5 anys.
Ja fa 5 anys.
Ja fa 5 anys, precisament, d'aquest moment que explicava el Josep, on estàvem en el marc del Poble Nou, on va ser un dels primers espais de la ciutat que el mandat passat vam començar a voler transformar. Jo d'entrada sí que volia agrair moltíssim al Brent, a la Francesca i al David també per haver participat i haver pogut escoltar en primeres persones totes les experiències que estan posant sobre la taula. I crec que lliga moltíssim, evidentment, amb el que estem fent a la ciutat de Barcelona. Què hem après amb la pandèmia, però sobretot què havíem après ja abans de la pandèmia? Jo crec que aquesta és la primera pregunta que ens hem de fer, i crec que abans de la pandèmia ja sabíem que el repte a les ciutats passava per afrontar dos elements que crec que ho resumeixen tot. D'una banda, la desigualtat, i per tant, com fer de la ciutat un espai just per tothom, que ningú hagi de deixar casa seva, que ningú hagi de marxar del seu barri, que tothom tingui els drets bàsics garantits, com l'accés a l'aigua, l'energia, però també una altra de les qüestions centrals, que és l'emergència climàtica. Com aconseguir que aquestes ciutats, que en un moment determinat van ser dissenyades per poder ser més eficients i més eficaços i concentrar població que volia accedir a un habitatge, que volia accedir en condicions, a una feina de qualitat, doncs que en aquest moment s'han convertit en espais que juguen, que tenen elements difícils des de la perspectiva de donar resposta a l'emergència climàtica que tenim, perquè és on es concentra la contaminació, on es concentren les activitats que generen, per exemple, CO2, i que, per tant, ens fan mal, que ens generen problemes de salut. Per tant, jo crec que aquests dos reptes, emergència climàtica i desigualtat, eren els reptes que teníem abans de la pandèmia i que segurament la pandèmia, la Covid, el que ens fa és veure que això és una problemàtica que tenim encara més urgent, perquè la pandèmia ens fa sentir vulnerables i ens posa al centre la salut. La salut. Com la salut entra a canviar-ho tot, perquè està en joc la nostra vida, i som plenament conscients. I alhora, d'alguna forma, mostra les oportunitats, les fortaleses que tenim com a ciutats per respondre a aquesta vulnerabilitat. En el cas de Barcelona, per exemple, el fet que som una ciutat de barris com aquest, com Sant Antoni, amb proximitat, que té equipaments, que té veïns, que té xarxa comunitària. I per tant, jo que visc al Poble Sec, he vist com els veïns ens hem ajudat durant tot aquest temps i hem sabut concretament què passava, si hi havia algú que no estava atès, i hem pogut generar aquesta xarxa de confort i de compartir aquestes situacions. I per tant aquest és un element molt, molt potent i és una oportunitat, com aprofitem el que és una feblesa, la densitat. Abans el Brent ho estava comentant. Les ciutats denses alhora fan que ens n'adonem que no tenim espai públic disponible per poder-lo utilitzar i per poder, fins i tot, des d'una perspectiva de ciutats denses, com la de Barcelona, que som una de les ciutats més denses, per no dir la més densa d'Europa, que multiplica en densitat, en cotxe metre quadrat, multipliquem per 2 la densitat que té Madrid i per 3 la que té Londres. O sigui, Barcelona té una concentració molt, molt forta de vehicles. I per tant, això d'alguna forma ens qüestiona precisament què passa amb el nostre espai públic i com les nostres cases, que en aquest context d'emergència sanitària i de salut hem vist que es feien petites, que nosaltres som una ciutat on la gent utilitza molt l'espai públic perquè és una extensió de les nostres cases. I durant la pandèmia aquest espai públic no era accessible i les cases no tenien la majoria de les cases no tenen grans terrasses, no tenen grans espais oberts. I per tant, no només hem trobat a faltar aquell carrer que utilitzàvem, sinó que quan hem pogut sortir al carrer hem volgut disposar de més espai públic per fer més coses, per fer moltes més coses. I jo crec que aquests són alguns dels elements que han sacsejat d'allò que ja veníem veient, que necessitàvem, que Barcelona és una ciutat on el 60% de l'espai públic amb aquesta densitat tan forta està ocupada perquè passin cotxes o aparquin cotxes. Per què? Perquè històricament s'ha anat desenvolupant així, no perquè, i aquí a Barcelona que tenim la nostra trama Cerdà, que fa 2 segles que es va impulsar i que d'alguna forma va ser tan important per garantir la salubritat i la higiene de totes les persones, a més amb aquesta mirada popular d'arribar als col·lectius també com més ho necessitaven ja en aquell moment. Avui aquest pla podem veure que al llarg de tota aquesta història s'ha desvirtuat, que l'especulació i que el vehicle privat, que el cotxe, han desvirtuat aquest pla. I, per tant, la importància de recuperar-lo i de reimpulsar una proposta i un canvi de model urbà que faciliti que la ciutat doni resposta a la desigualtat i a l'emergència climàtica. Perquè també, durant la pandèmia, ens hem acostumat clarament a veure els nostres carrers més lliures, poder-los gaudir, a no sentir tant soroll. El tema del soroll ha sigut un gran descobriment per moltes persones que viuen al costat de grans vies, com el carrer Aragó, com el carrer Mallorca o el carrer València, l'avinguda Meridiana, i per tant la necessitat de fer aquesta transició. Jo crec que la pandèmia ha fet això, ha fet l'acceleració, ha suposat l'acceleració d'aquesta transició de ser una ciutat del segle XX, amb alguns elements, perquè Barcelona té ja una llarga trajectòria de veïns reivindicatius que ha aconseguit que tinguem uns barris ben dotats d'equipaments i d'alguns espais importants d'espai lliure, però no suficients. I, per tant, de com fem aquesta transició de la ciutat del segle XX a la ciutat del segle XXI. Jo crec que la pandèmia ens ha ajudat a fer aquest canvi, a accelerar-lo i a fer mesures que han esdevingut provisionals i que ara tot just comencem ja la transformació definitiva. I, per tant, tots aquests carrers d'urbanisme tàctic que hem vist, totes aquestes actuacions, per exemple, per donar suport al comerç de proximitat, per donar suport a la restauració de la nostra ciutat, ara es consoliden i es fan definitives. I, per tant, hem estat en un moment en què de cop vam tornar a sortir als carrers i els carrers havien canviat. Havíem canviat perquè nosaltres també estàvem canviant, perquè la situació que estàvem vivint estava canviant i perquè necessitem una nova planificació urbana. Hi ha hagut coses molt interessants que la Shirley, el David han situat i em sembla importantíssim. I la Francesca ho deia també a nivell europeu, és a dir, quines són les bases, de quina manera hem de planificar i dissenyar el futur de les ciutats. Jo crec que això és el que està en qüestió i crec que a la ciutat de Barcelona veiem que històricament s'ha promocionat una sèrie d'actuacions, però que altres s'han promocionat menys. I crec que és el moment de reequilibrar aquesta injustícia. Igual que diem, el 60% de l'espai està ocupat per cotxes, ara el que necessitem és que bona part d'aquest espai estigui ocupat per nens i nenes, que també han de dir com volen que sigui la seva ciutat present i futura, perquè seran ells també les que la viuran. També hem de poder pensar com la gent gran, la nostra gent gran, que necessita un banc, a vegades per recolzar-se quan va a comprar i poder seure i descansar, o per estar més temps en l'espai públic. Una ciutat mediterrània com la nostra és agradable estar en els carrers pràcticament totes les estacions de l'any, que les dones que també vivim la ciutat d'una manera diferent, perquè segurament no totes les dones o majoritàriament les dones utilitzem el transport públic, això ens ho diuen ja les dades, les dones són més usuàries del transport públic històricament que els homes. Per exemple, què vol dir això? Com es tradueix això? En quin transport públic? Per fer quins trajectes? Totes aquestes actuacions i totes aquestes necessitats avui han d'agafar més força a la ciutat precisament per enfortir allò que ens fa forts, que és menys contaminació, per tant, més salut i també més proximitat, més comerç, més equipaments, perquè ens fa més propers. Jo crec que aquest és el nou sentit comú que recorre Europa, que recorre el món, perquè ho han explicat molt bé. Europa està dissenyant el model de futur cap aquí. Veiem com ciutats de tot el món, de tots els continents, especialment les ciutats grans també europees, com pot ser Londres, com pot ser París, i Barcelona, estem obligades a treballar en aquesta direcció i totes hem fet el mateix. Jo me n'adono que qualsevol persona, quan parlem amb la Shirley, que hem fet algunes trobades i hem comentat què estem fent amb la zona de baixes emissions o amb el David de París, que hem dit com actuem per protegir els nostres nens i nenes, protegint les escoles, garantint que les escoles siguin espais més segurs per a aquests nens i nenes, que respirin menys contaminació. Veiem que totes estem fent el mateix i que a poc anem consolidant aquest nou sentit comú com una realitat front a un model del passat, front a un model que no ens serveix per garantir precisament que les nostres ciutats segueixin existint i siguin espais de vida, i siguin espais on ningú no hagi de marxar ni vulgui marxar de la ciutat. Jo crec que aquest és l'objectiu, que qui ens estimem la ciutat fem tot el possible perquè aquest moment de transició, que a vegades és difícil d'entendre, perquè et trobes que estan les coses a mig camí, estem en obres, estem transformant per consolidar precisament aquest canvi en una ciutat nova, en una ciutat millor. I això és, per exemple, el nostre projecte, que d'alguna forma és aquesta idea de la ciutat dels 15 minuts, que ja ho és, que ja és aquesta ciutat pròxima, que és el Pla Superilla a Barcelona.
Fantàstic. I potser en aquesta equació de millores, en aquesta urgència per millorar-les, this urgency to make better these cities, there's a very important issue, which is, of course, the relation, and I think that the pandemic brought us this discussion or this issue about the city that we had during the pandemic, to bring the city inside of the house and feel that the houses that we live needed to be rethought. And after the pandemic, how do we go back to the streets and then claim that those streets are becoming part of our house? Now we have this great opportunity to transform, of course, public space, as we always did and we always talked in this old model of the transformation of the city, but now we have to do it with a different eyes. And those eyes, which I think could be this capacity to transform the city as part of our house. And this is, I wanted to extend this issue also, and maybe to talk about which are not only, we talked about before a little bit about the model that we are dealing, but also would be interesting to see the strategies or the tactics that should follow to implement those models. Because of course we kind of agree definitely that which city we would like to have, but it's definitely urgent to, or it's interesting or important to kind of know the management of this shift. And definitely some of them you've already said, some of those tactics that should be implemented to go forward to those models. So I would ask, which measures should we urgently now, after the COVID, implement to go forward to those, to pursue those models? And of course I have to ask you, to all of you, Francesca, to go forward with the same order that we went before.
Okay, yes, thanks. Maybe just a reaction to what I've heard from the other speakers. My reflection is that, well, a couple of reflections. The first one is that, as it was said by also the other speakers, I think one very important point of cities is this capacity to do large-scale experimentations, which are policy experimentations, which are new urbanistic forms, which are regulatory experimentation, and that can scale. And so they can become a really structural transformation. I think this is the first point. It was made also before by some of you. If we are able to run those experiments in a way that we involve really the citizens and the communities, and we involve everybody that has a say or has the skills and capacity to make those changes, and then we turn them into structural interventions, this is basically what we need to do, because otherwise the risk is that we learn very fast, we are able to improvise, but then, we struggle to turn it into something that really changed the public administration, I would say. And the second point is that we need to regain public power to do that. And many of you, of course, speak about, the need to, rethink, transform the center of the cities, take away cars, reforestation, new energy policies, the fight against climate change, integrated transportation systems, of course, social equalities. I mean, these are big transformation of citizens' the way citizens live, basically. And I think we need to be aware that we really have to give a direction to those transformations. So it is not enough to accelerate them. It was said, of course, during the pandemic, we reacted in an accelerated way. I think also digitization was super accelerated. All of a sudden, the entire population was, started to use infrastructure and connectivity and applications and technology to do anything. And of course, the transformations towards a different way of living was accelerated, but we need to give to those transformations a direction. And this direction has to be our political choice, which means exactly moving towards this more democratic, more social justice and green and digital society. So I think we also have to create strong capabilities. I think cities have to create capabilities also internal to the public administration, reclaim more financial capacity. I don't know if you have the same capacity to invest, for example, in new type of infrastructure, in new type of social services. I mean, to be able to really have a say when it comes, for example, for European cities, this is very clear in relation to the Next Generation EU, the biggest investment plan with a clear, let's say, shared industrial and growth strategy for Europe. Obviously, cities need to reclaim a pie of that investment share, being able to invest by themselves, but also, as Jeanette says, create good jobs for women, first of all, for youth, and decent quality jobs have to be created from this transition. And this is, of course, you need to create a lot of capabilities, because at the moment, we have problems with the high energy prices. We have problem with the supply chain, with shortage of critical, material and components. Think about, like rare earth, and think about microchips, and think about critical materials that will make possible to transition to renewable energy production, to electric batteries, to make our mobility, for example, real electric and sustainable and shared. So there are a lot of different issues, and I think we basically need to, just to summarize it, really to reclaim this public power to act and to make those changes that you are talking about scalable. And I would say not only in one city, scalable throughout, at least, throughout Europe, in a much more coherent way and in a much more, unite way, because I think many of those changes will be replicable, and we need, of course, shared regulatory approaches to this transformation. So I think this is maybe something that should be discussed in cities, standard settings, what kind of legislation, how to, for example, limit the market power of certain actors when it comes to energy concentration of market power, or when it comes to the digital world, which is super concentrated, and we have only few players basically managing the critical infrastructures of the future. I think that's where cities can actually show that a democratic, to reclaim, a democratic governance of critical infrastructures and critical urban infrastructures, including, data connectivity and the key components for the digital transition, as Barcelona has done, for example, with Barcelona Energia, redistributing renewable energy to the people and making sure that people can produce renewable energy, and making sure that the super blocks are also energy producing units, so that we can produce energy in a shared way and use digital technologies, data as a public good, to empower people and not just to be amassed and accumulated in the hands of very few players. So I think there's going to be who is going to manage electric mobility in the city and how it will be managed. There are a lot of questions that require cities to come together in many different levels. And I think that's where the strategic mind of mayors will be absolutely needed, because then you can make regulation also happening from the bottom up.
Thank you, Francesca. So this like regain this public power, this public leadership also. So Brent, which are these public power to act, which are these actions that you think should be implemented urgently?
Well, what I would say is because my work is often with the leaders and helping cities successfully manage bold change. That's probably the best description of what I do. And how to also change the public conversation about change, because sometimes the public leads change and sometimes the public is quite resistant to change and everything in between. So how do you have this conversation about badly needed change, the consequences of not changing, to either bring the public along, or if the public is already ahead of the leaders, how do you get the leaders to actually listen to their own public? What I find in my work is that there's great power in inspiration and competition. In other words, what other cities do matters to cities. And so all of you who are doing things for your cities that are significant and bold can have the confidence that the benefit of that goes well beyond your municipal boundaries. Because often it's said, well, how much can we do in our city? What I know is that every city that takes leadership, either from its public or from its leaders or both, inspires other cities, both through the power of inspiration and the power of competition. Competition in the sense that I find all mayors want to get the kind of credit that other mayors get when they do good things. And I embrace that idea of competition, because competition is often a motivator for mayors and cities to do more and to go further faster. So when a Paris does something, when a Barcelona does something, when an Amsterdam does something, when a Madrid does something, a London does something, it is significant and it inspires many cities. But my favorite kinds of cities for inspiration are what it might be called the surprising leaders, the surprising heroes, the unexpected heroes. What I found here in North America, for example, is that the two cities that got the most attention during the pandemic for quick action and smart action in the context of making things safer for their people were two very unlikely cities. They weren't the big, sexy cities. They were Vilnius, Lithuania, the capital of Lithuania, and Oakland, California. And in part because nobody really expected leadership maybe from those cities. But Vilnius was the first leader in Europe that we saw that transformed their streets into an open air cafe and rethought their public spaces to help support their restaurants. And suddenly I saw city after city in North America quoting Vilnius, Lithuania, which I suspect is something they'd never done before, as their inspiration for a new policy on transforming their sidewalks and streets for outdoor seating in restaurants and cafe seating, etc., to save small businesses. Similarly, Oakland, California didn't do small moves. They, right off the bat, near the beginning of the pandemic, transformed 10% of their total road space, equitably distributed through all neighborhoods, rich and poor, and closed them to cars and opened them to people. And they were by far the most ambitious city, and nobody expected that of Oakland, California. And in both cases, I started to hear this phrase that I love to hear, which is, if they could do it, we could do it. And that's not always a phrase you hear when you're thinking about London or Barcelona or Paris, because many cities in the world don't really think of themselves as similar to London or Barcelona and Paris. But if Oakland, California, or Vilnius, Lithuania can do it, they should be able to do it too. So I find that power of learning, and the fact that we have through social media immediate access to that information, because all of us are tweeting or Instagramming what these cities are doing, and leaders are and media from around the world are picking up on these ideas and suddenly doing media stories. It spreads so fast. This power of inspiration and competition spreads so fast. So I embrace that strongly. But then we can have the conversation about not copying other cities, but what can we learn from other cities to apply to our existing situation. I've heard a number of key things that I believe in and talk about with my clients said today. First of all, I've spoken about the need to take fast and nimble action. Involve the public, but don't have endless consultation to the point of not addressing an emergency quickly enough. So bring in your community leaders into the conversation, have the right people around the table, but don't be afraid of fast and nimble action. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but have a culture of being willing to adjust when you're seeing that something isn't working well, and adjust quickly. Be inexpensive, because frankly, some of the most successful strategies I saw, particularly in cities that don't have the kind of money as rich cities, were surprisingly inexpensive. And as a matter of fact, many of the solutions I saw that spent more money were less successful. So don't be afraid to do things quickly and strategically and inexpensively. I've heard many people talk about the strategic advantage of addressing what's already there. And I think European cities are better at this than other cities. Paris, Madrid, Oslo, many of the cities addressed cars in their center city, not initially for climate change, although you always had that as part of the conversation, but it was about urban pollution. And someone said that people take very personally their family's health today. I've talked a lot about the need to talk about something that's in people's faces already. And urban pollution is a great example, but use that as a bridge to have broader conversations about public health, including certainly the calamitous public health implications of climate change. Advance existing plans. Take the things you were already working on and speed them up. I've said to many of my city clients, if all you did was look at all the things that are already on your books, but you're planning to do it over 20 years, and instead you did it over 5 years, that would be a very strong move, because you've already decided it's a good idea. Just think about how to do it faster, because frankly, what urgency and emergency and crisis, these words tell us, is frankly, we're taking too long in our response to things. So take the ideas you already know and do them faster. The last thing I'll say, and by the way, 2 things that were said that are absolutely key. Make sure that your solutions are not a car-led recovery. And that's, again, something that North American cities are very bad at. We've let the cars back in. And once they're back in, they don't want to leave again. And make sure that your strategies don't increase social inequalities. Certainly here in North America, we actually had 2 turning points last year. One was the pandemic. The other was the murder of George Floyd and the dramatic conversation that was created. I say dramatic in a good way, a necessary way, about how social equity issues, racism, equality plays out in the public realm at the same time as we're thinking about finding more space for people and less space for cars. So the social equity lens has to be absolutely critical to any strategy, or that strategy will fail. I'll say at the end, we've talked about a number of branded strategies, the 15-minute city, for example. My friend Carlos in Paris was a leader in that. What I've said is that's not a new idea. We've been talking about complete communities, the city of short distances, what I've called for 15 years, the power of nearness, which is not nearly as good a brand as the 15-minute city. Melbourne had its 20-minute cities for a few decades. What Paris did, really understand this, is not create a new idea, but they branded it better than any city had ever done. They packaged it better than any city had ever done. And the mayor, not the chief planner hidden in a planning document, but the mayor made it a critical component of her re-election campaign. So gave it a profile, even dedicated a deputy mayor specifically responsible for the 15-minute city. So created a power position within the organization. That's what Paris did. They did it better than anyone else. And you don't need new ideas. What I've often said with many of my clients is, I'm not convinced that the 15-minute city or the 15-minute communities is the right answer for every place, but it's a very good conversation for every place to have. What does a 15-minute city mean for our city? What could it mean? Does it mean the same thing in a city that it does in a suburb or in a rural area? I'm doing 2 regional plans in Australia right now where we're trying to apply the 15-minute idea to contexts all through a region. Big cities, small city, villages, towns, rural areas, cities, suburbs. and figure out what it could mean in all those different contexts. And that's a very good conversation to have when you're creating new policy. So whatever your model is, if it's the 15-minute city, the city of short distances, if it's the traffic zone strategy that Birmingham, England just announced, learning from places like Groningen, Netherlands, and Ghent, Belgium, and Oslo has already also done that, whether it's the super block of Barcelona or the five-finger plan of Copenhagen. There's all sorts of strategies that may or may not educate your local city's conversation, but what's similar in all of those strategies, and this is the important thing for cities, is they all address, the good ones all address both mobility and land use together as one conversation. They all have the intention of having fewer cars and less driving, not necessarily banning cars, but fewer cars and less driving. And they are all decisive and definitive. They're not wishy-washy. And they create a strong structure for change, and they create a constituency for change. You know, that my favorite example just came to me today, speaking to Francesca's point about public and grassroots leadership. The city of Berlin has announced that a grassroots community initiative has received enough petition signatures, 50,000, to potentially get the idea of a car light center city for Berlin to a public referendum. And that was entirely public-led. It can be public-led, it can be private-led, but all of these strategies, the successful ones, have similar characteristics. Fewer cars, less driving, better city for people with more delightful choices for where they live and how they get around that don't involve the car and sprawl.
Thank you, Brian. Great. I would add maybe to those models, of course, the strong relation, as I said before, with houses and housing and the interior of the house as being completely related with that model, no? Which I think in Barcelona is one of the big issues. No? Before we talked only about public space, now we try to deal this idea of public space related with housing. And I completely agree, you know, this competition as a motivation, it's a nice point of view, no? And how, though, this motivation, it's a motivation to collaborate. It would be also an interesting issue, and I think this act here is the one step forward to that collaboration. No? It's a question to Shirley and to Janet. No? How do you think our cities can really share, not compete, of course, in this idea of being motivated to compete, but also and mainly to collaborate and take those ideas from one city to another? Shirley or Janet?
Well, I start? Yeah.
Shirley.
Yeah. Well, I think we're already doing it. So both Janet, Barcelona and London are members of the C40 cities. We're also members of many other city networks. And Brent's point was, the competition, that healthy competition of sort of understanding what other cities are doing and saying, well, why aren't we doing that? I mean, there are reasons why we may not have the same powers or we may not have the same funding, but, there is still the reason, the question then raises the sort of debate about, well, what could we do instead if we don't have the powers? And that sort of competition drives ambition. So I think that's one thing. And the best practice sharing, stealing each other's ideas, whether it's from big cities or small cities, many of the things in London have come from many small cities, in fact, and we're able to do things differently or maybe to different scale, precisely because of that. And I just wanted to echo a lot of what Brent said about what we need to do in terms of reimagining our cities. But I think that the thing that I would emphasize most is if you're trying to bring people along, you have to listen to what their concerns are. And it isn't always climate change, and it isn't always the density of a city. It's going to be, how do I get my kids to school safely? How do I do it in a way that means their lives are extended? Air pollution isn't killing them. How do I make sure that what I'm doing is going to mean that there is a good job for my family? It's those things that we talk about in communicating why we want to make these changes or why we need to accelerate these changes. And then behind that, the solutions are about walking, cycling, electric vehicles, electric buses, transforming our economy, and so on. And I think the other thing I would say is the leadership point. Whether it's the mayor, particularly in London, Mayor Khan, Sadiq Khan, really pushing ahead with his ambition for the city to become a place of good air quality. It would have taken near enough 2 centuries to get London back into legal levels of air pollution. We're doing it in 6 years because of the combination of policies, the ultra-low emission zone, which we're expanding in 2 weeks' time to pretty much the most of London, inner London area, covering, more than 1 million people, many millions of, cars and so on. This is really important, that leadership. And it's about, when you bring something in, even some of the small schemes that came in during the pandemic, it's holding your nerve as a leader, and whether that's a political leader or a business person or a community leader, it's give it time to bed in. And often people then see the benefits of better air quality or safer streets, or more connected communities. So I think those are the things I would just emphasize.
The same question, do you think this competition can become a collaboration, and definitely with these impressive actions that most of those cities has already taken care, which are the lessons that we can imply with this collaboration?
Sí, jo crec que ja estem col·laborant, no? Ho deia la Shirley, almenys les grans ciutats europees ens trobem en molts espais i estem compartint, des de la col·laboració, des de contagiar-nos de totes aquestes lluites, perquè ens passa el mateix, perquè tenim més en comú que allò que ens diferencia, però és evident que el context ens posa uns reptes sobre la taula molt importants i ens ho posa a les ciutats. Les ciutats som la primera trinxera de la ciutadania. Quan algú té un problema, on va? A la ciutat. I és el primer espai on es reivindica qualsevol necessitat. I això posa de manifest el fet que les ciutats necessitem enfortir-nos globalment, també a l'hora de demanar que volem més recursos, que volem més competències. Nosaltres sempre ho diem molt clarament, que no sigui de la nostra competència no vol dir que no sigui de la nostra incumbència. I en matèria d'habitatge és l'exemple més bèstia que tenim. No tenim competències en habitatge, però som l'única administració que fa habitatge a la ciutat de Barcelona, habitatge públic. Estem fent més de 4.000 habitatges a la ciutat, estem revisant tot allò que s'ha fet en matèria d'habitatge, estem innovant. Per exemple, fa un temps també, fa un parell, 3 d'anys, vam aprovar una mesura que ara s'extendrà a tot l'Estat, que també és molt important, que és que qualsevol promoció d'habitatge tingui que destinar un 30% privada, a promocions d'habitatge privats, hagin de destinar un 30% a habitatge assequible. Això és una cosa que a París o Londres ja havien fet. I nosaltres ens vam fixar i vam dir, necessitem això. Per què? Perquè no només hi ha prou amb que la ciutat faci habitatge públic, també necessitem que els privats es corresponsabilitzin de fer-ho. Per tant, no defugim les responsabilitats, tot i no tenir els mateixos recursos que pot tenir la Generalitat o l'Estat per fer habitatge públic, però a més també posem unes regles del joc diferents. Urbanísticament, les ciutats tenim molt poder i l'hem d'utilitzar. Les nostres eines són la planificació i el disseny urbà i, per tant, amb les eines urbanístiques podem capgirar moltes de les coses que s'han fet. L'urbanisme històricament ha generat guanyadors o perdedors, i creiem que no és una disciplina o una tècnica neutra i, per tant, l'objectiu és posar-la al servei de la ciutat, és fer un urbanisme just, que reparteixi els beneficis, no que faciliti l'especulació. I aquesta és una de les grans lluites. Abans la Francesca ho deia, aquesta democràcia radical que hem de construir, on la ciutadania prengui la paraula i posi aquestes condicions, em sembla fonamental quan tenim aquestes eines potents per tirar-ho endavant. Crec que també hi ha una altra de les qüestions fonamentals que ha sortit i que des de Barcelona ho estem treballant moltíssim, que és la innovació. La necessitat de ser creatius i d'innovar. El fet que Barcelona ha estat escollida la propera capital mundial de l'arquitectura. perquè té un llegat i perquè té una història, però perquè té un present i té un futur. I crec que això també és un element perquè estem innovant, perquè estem generant noves solucions. Fa poques setmanes Europa ens ha premiat amb aquest projecte de la nova Bauhaus, ha reconegut 2 projectes que són molt, molt especials. Un, que és habitatge públic construït ràpid, els a prop, que són la nostra marca d'aquest habitatge en contenidors, però que és un habitatge de primer nivell que es construeix molt ràpid i que facilita l'accés i el dret a l'habitatge. Però no només, també la potenciació d'aconseguir que més espais de la ciutat tinguin verd, perquè la natura s'ha de reapropiar de la ciutat. Fa molts anys es va excloure la natura de les ciutats i ara hem de tornar a deixar que la ciutat ens envaeixi aquesta natura i, per tant, aprofitar cada racó i les cobertes verdes. Aquests 2 projectes que han estat innovadors i impulsats des de lo públic, però també en col·laboració amb coneixement, amb entitats de la nostra ciutat, amb el sector privat responsable, que fa les coses bé, que es preocupa del futur de la nostra ciutat. Jo crec que aquest és l'objectiu, és exprémer al màxim totes aquestes competències, les que no tenim, desenvolupar-ho i, evidentment, donar resposta a aquesta màxima que jo abans resumia entre desigualtat i emergència climàtica, que crec que també té una altra manera d'explicar-se, que és fer compatible arribar a final de mes amb la lluita contra la fi del planeta. Fer compatible aquestes 2 coses són fonamentals i tenim el repte de fer-ho quotidianament, demostrant que és possible, que hi ha una alternativa i contagiar-nos amb aquesta lògica de l'ambició, no de la competició, sinó de ser totes ambicioses entre nosaltres, perquè si no som les ciutats, qui? I si no és ara, quan?
Molt bé, crec que ens hem just consumit tot el temps, però evidentment no podem acabar sense obrir el torn de paraules a tothom que estigui connectat o aquí a la sala, per qui tingui preguntes per als ponents i les ponents.
Si hi ha algú, perquè...
No sé qui controla les preguntes online, però allà n'hi ha un, fantàstic.
Shall I ask it in English or in Spanish? Okay.
Hi ha traducció,
I'm sorry, but I don't speak Catalan. So there is something very interesting that COVID brought to us, which is the issue of uncertainty and the unexpected. This is a very new dimension we need to learn how to deal with it, because it makes decision-making very difficult. So my question to you, to all of you, is how do you factor in this new dimension into your decision-making process as civil servants, right? The lady who is, I don't remember your name, she sort of introduced some answer, which is the idea of a change in the hierarchy of values. The economic value has been very important in cities and in countries, but now all of a sudden safety and security becomes very important, right? So one question to her is, how do we align all the constituencies of a city around this value? And what is the critical social infrastructure that we need in order to respond to that value? And how are we going to finance it? Thank you. Thank you.
Si volen dir alguna cosa.
Who wants to answer about uncertain futures? And how do we take... I couldn't hear very well because it was not very clear, but about how do we take decisions in a world which is definitely uncertain?
Can I ask, I had some distortion at the beginning of the question. Was the new dynamic he was referencing, was he specifically saying the new dynamic is safety and security, or was it this broader issue of uncertainty?
No, era en general.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
Uncertainty? Okay, well, what I would say, Two things I've observed in city planning practice around the world. The first is the best way to address uncertainty, which has always been there, but maybe it feels more uncertain now, is what's called in the business scenarios planning. We can't do plans and strategies anymore that assumes that certain things will happen. And the thing that's normally assumed is that the same things will happen in the future that's happened in the past. That leads to some pretty bad plans. So the technique that actual companies use, including oil companies around the world, called scenarios planning, where they think, how can our strategies be robust to address not only crises and emergencies and calamity, but just different conditions. Oil companies use it to plan their future of their companies based on whether oil is $5 a barrel or $50 a barrel or $500 a barrel. And what I've done in cities and seen done in cities is if you can do your scenario, your planning and your strategies around, say, the health of your downtown, considering scenarios that might be more or less favorable to the downtown, and make sure your strategies are robust and resilient enough to position you to prosper no matter what conditions you end up applying, then you're going to have a much better strategy. But that's frankly a new way of doing plans that's only been around for about 10 years or so, and many cities still aren't doing it. And to me, that's the best way to embrace the uncertainty of our future. Because one thing I've always said about projections and visions and predictions is they're almost always wrong. We just don't know in what direction and by how much. And so I don't worry too much about what will happen. I worry about what we want to have happen, how to plan and position our cities, our downtowns, our regions, etc., for success, no matter what conditions we end up finding ourselves facing.
Thank you. I think that they are telling us that we should be finishing. Well, thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Bren, Shirley, Janet, and David that was talking to us through the video. And just finishing as we started, this subtitle, the city of the future. I think that the city of the future, we know, and now we were just talking about this, we have this uncertain future ahead, but we know that it has to be accelerated, as you were saying, but also to bring directions, but maybe to detour also, because we know that the future will detour our directions because of the sequence of crises that we definitely will have to lead. And of course, leadership, public leadership, and with all those ingredients, what we definitely know is that our cities are becoming a laboratory, like Francesca was saying, and Janet, putting the accent through the idea of innovation, which is something we definitely are dealing with all these new models that are being implemented in all those different cities. So thank you very much, you all, for being here, and to the ones that have connected. And thank you very much, all the opponents, for this. Thank you.